Hello and welcome back to the Biochemistry for Health Sciences channel. In the past few videos, we talked about carbohydrates, specifically the use of carbohydrates such as glucose as a very important fuel source for the human body. And then we talked about how carbohydrates such as the smaller ones, the oligosaccharides, are very information-rich molecules. We can make all kinds of shapes, and therefore they are very good in identification, so very rich in information. Today we'll talk about an area called the glycocalyx, which is very rich in this information-rich carbohydrates. So the title of this video is Glycocalyx is more than a sweet husk. So glyco is the sugar, the sweetness. Calyx is a covering or a husk. So just to remind you, in the previous videos we talked about how oligosaccharides can form many different shapes. And in biology, in our human bodies, shapes is basically information, very rich in information, because molecules bind to other molecules, and that binding leads to some sort of biological or physiological process. Okay, so very rich in information, oligosaccharides. So why do these oligosaccharides, why can they form so many shapes? The first reason is there are many different monosaccharides that make up the oligosaccharides, which we talked about in the previous video. And the second reason is because we can join one monosaccharide to another monosaccharide in many different ways, just because of the reaction of joining two monosaccharides together. So if we were to compare a 6 monosaccharides joined together, what we call a hexasaccharide, you can make theoretically billions of hexasaccharides. If you did that with nucleotides to form a nucleic acid, about 4,000. If you did that with proteins, only 64 million. Okay, so clearly this is billions. These oligosaccharides are very rich in information, so very rich in information. And information is very critical for our cells, things like cell signaling, which controls many processes in our cells and in our body. So one of the areas that is very rich in carbohydrates is this part called the glycocalyx. Okay, so the glycocalyx is this part here shown in green that surrounds all the cells. So here's a neuron, which is glycocalyx, shown in green. Here's a red blood cell with its glycocalyx, shown in green. Here are endothelial cells that line your blood vessels, your capillaries, and this is your bloodstream. And you can see the green glycocalyx. So clearly this glycocalyx, which is very rich in carbohydrates, is surrounding all types of cells. And because they are information rich, they clearly play a very important role in biology and eventually in physiology. We don't talk much about it these days, surprisingly, but more recent research and articles are clearly showing the very, very important role of glycocalyx in many different physiological processes. So one of the objectives of this channel is to prepare healthcare professionals for the future. So this is one area that you would see increasing in terms of its importance in the near future for healthcare professionals as well as students. Let's have a closer look at this glycocalyx. What is this glycocalyx? So here's your cell membrane, your lipid bilayer, and you can see on the surface of the cell all these carbohydrates. So for example, hyaluronan is a very, very long carbohydrate chain, very, very long, very high molecular weight. And then you have all carbohydrates that are attached to proteins. We call them glycoproteins. And then you have proteins that are attached to carbohydrates. We call them proteoglycans. And then you have all these different oligosaccharides, carbohydrates attached to lipids. So clearly there are a lot of oligosaccharides around the cell. And again, these are very rich in information. So all kinds of shapes, you will have all kinds of shapes around the outside of the cell in terms of carbohydrates. And remember, these carbohydrates, they like water, so the outside of the cell is rich in water. So these molecules are quite soluble, so they stay outside the cell. So let's look at a few functions. There are so many functions that are coming out now, the importance of glycocalyx. But let's just look at a few examples just to give you an idea of what to expect in the near future. So here, for example, in the first example, the endothelial cells, so these are shown here in the endothelial cells that line your blood vessels. The glycocalyx acts as a sensor, a mechanosensor. It senses the force of blood flowing. Okay, it senses the force. And based on the force, the glycocalyx, which is hanging out in the blood from the surface of the endothelial cells, it is actually sending signals into the endothelial cells and triggering appropriate cell signaling so that the endothelial cells can adapt to the changing blood flow. These endothelial cells play a very critical role in many, many different processes, including inflammation. We now know that the glycocalyx of cells affects the shape of the cell morphology. For example, cells can form tubules, all kinds of tubules, like membrane tubules. And these tubules are very important, play a lot of roles. For example, they help detect antigens in certain immune cells. They are very important in cell signaling, in tissue development, and in formation of vesicles in the cell. The glycocalyx plays a very important role in recycling of membrane proteins, such as receptors, example LDL receptors, and we'll talk about this in future videos. So the glycocalyx now we know play a very important role in bringing back the receptors to the surface of the cell. There's a lot of interest in the role of glycocalyx in cancer cells. So it's interesting that glycocalyx is not a static area of the cell. It's very dynamic. It changes. And we know that cancer cells can change their glycocalyx, which causes an enhancement of tumor growth, as well as spread of the cancer metastasis, and also help the cancer cell avoid the immune cell destruction. So glycocalyx in cancer is an area of very, very important research that's going on right now. So all of these properties is mostly because of the different shapes of oligosaccharides. Okay, the information of the rich information that's present in the oligosaccharides due to the variety of shapes. The last two here, two more examples. This is more because of the property of glycocalyx. It's a very dense gel-like network, so it can protect. For example, it can prevent the microbe from entering into your tissue because of this very dense glycocalyx. Basically, the microbe can get trapped here, and then the immune cells can destroy the microbe before it gets a chance to enter the tissues. So the glycocalyx has a protective role. Effect on oncotic pressure. So a lot of controversy on the Starling law and things like edema and so on. So we shall talk about this in a future video. But albumin is a protein with very high concentrations in your bloodstream. So basically, let me just erase this. So this example basically tells us that it's not easy for albumin to cross the glycocalyx because it's a very dense area. So the glycocalyx is going to affect albumin transport across the endothelial cells from the bloodstream into the tissues. And that, of course, is going to have a very important effect on oncotic pressure because albumin is the major protein that affects oncotic pressure. So just to conclude, the glycocalyx is not simply a sweet covering or a sweet husk. The glycocalyx, which unfortunately many books do not pay enough attention, or is a very, very important part of the cell, and is something you have to keep in mind and understand, especially in the near future, where we will see the role of glycocalyx in many biological processes that are going to have very important implications in healthcare. Okay, so that is it for now. We shall hopefully see you in the next video. Until then, this is Professor saying goodbye and have a good day.